Yeah, let's avoid that.
Yeah. What are the chances it happens twice? Or one at a time?
It's very contagious.
Okay.
It's not.
So, we have 4 lectures left.
So
The
many.
next 3 are on the last exam, and then there's 1 lecture after the last exam. It's on that material will be on the final exam, but it won't be on anything other. I guess it will be on a quiz, but it won't be on a lecture exam. Okay? So we've got 3 lectures today, Thursday, next Tuesday, and then that's the end of the material for the last exam. So there's going to be 3 lectures on the 4th exam. So we've got digestive system, and then renal system, and then reproductive system, and then after the exam is like genes and inheritance and things like that. But today is digestive system, and I think this is another one of those systems that can be interesting because it's things that you're familiar with. It's things that we deal with in real life. The renal system, you don't think about your kidneys all that much, right?
Unless they're failing.
Unless they're failing, yes. But if they're not failing, your kidneys are something you just take for granted. The digestive system, we're constantly dealing with. So the digestive system is the system that's composed of the gastrointestinal tract, or the GI tract. It's also called the alimentary canal. That's not a term you're ever going to probably hear.
Okay.
Digestive system, GI tract, gastrointestinal tract. And when you really think about it, it is a continuous system of tubes. From your mouth to your anus, it is one hollow system. Essentially, our body grew around an open area. Like the opening in the center of our digestive tract isn't really our body. Our body grew around a tube. Okay? And that's really what happens during development of an embryo. So we're going to learn an embryo starts as a sphere of cells. And what actually happens is you get a tube that runs down the center of that sphere, and that tube turns into your digestive tract. And everything around it turns into your body. And so your body literally forms around the digestive tract where the food passes through. So the organs in our GI tract, most of them you probably thought of. Some of them you may not have. And a lot of these are going to have sub-parts to them. So obviously there is the mouth. Our mouth is part of a number of different systems, but it is part of the digestive system. And then there's the pharynx. We learned about the pharynx in the respiratory system. But remember, several parts of that pharynx deal with both food and air. So the pharynx is part of the digestive system. And then where in respiratory, the pharynx leads into the trachea. For the digestive system, the epiglottis is going to push the food into the esophagus. Air goes into the trachea, food goes into the esophagus, hopefully, right? You all know, probably heard the phrase, you ate something, you're choking, and say it went down the wrong tube. Literally, it went down the wrong tube, and it was in your esophagus, it was in your trachea instead of your esophagus. So once it's in the esophagus, it goes down, ends up in your stomach, from the stomach, to the small intestine, to the large intestine. So small intestine comes before the large intestine. The GI tract as a whole is about 17 to 23 feet. I left this in their bullet point because I thought that was just a curious little qualifying statement. In a living person. Like in a dead person, eventually it turns into 0 feet long. And so I don't understand why they put that in there. Okay? And who cares about the length of a GI tract in a non-live person? Anyway. So There are also some accessory organs that go with the digestive system. The teeth, our tongue, salivary glands, liver. We learned the liver has a big role in breaking down blood cells, but also plays a very large role in the digestive system. There's the gallbladder, which you probably all heard of, may not know exactly what it does. And then there's the pancreas, which we learned about in the endocrine system. And so pancreas is also going to play a role in the digestive system. So when we take in food and we digest it, that process has 6 steps. Number 1 is digestion. Okay, that's just, ingestion. Ingestion. That's just taking food in. Once we get food into our body, we need to secrete things that are going to break that food down. Once we now have food and the things that are going to break down that food, we need to mix those things together. While we're mixing, we need to propel that food in digestive enzymes through the system. While that's happening, we are actually undergoing digestion. We're taking that food, we're breaking it down into simpler forms. If you eat a Pop-Tart, you cannot absorb Pop-Tart directly into your bloodstream. Okay? I suppose you could possibly inject Pop-Tart directly into your bloodstream, but that would not turn out well for you. Okay? So you need to digest it. Digestion is breaking it down into its most basic building blocks, whether that be proteins down into amino acids, carbohydrates down into monosaccharides, complex lipids down into simple lipids. Once you break it down, you're going to absorb the nutrients out of it, because you know that not everything you eat is actual nutrient to you, right? So you're going to absorb the nutrients out of that, and then you're going to defecate what is left over. So that's the main 6 steps in digestion. And so this is just what we were looking at, where we'll see a number of pictures like this, but we said the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus leads into the stomach leads into the small intestine, which leads into the large intestine. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of those large organs have subparts. So that is what all of these things are. The different types of the colon, the jejunum, the ileum, the duodenum, all things like that. The liver is the lid here. The liver is very large. It sits right next to the stomach. The gallbladder is just under the liver. It's actually attached to the liver. We'll learn about it, but the gallbladder is just like your bladder. It's a stretchy membranous sac that holds liquid. Okay? And it's going to hold something called bile. We'll learn about that. Bile comes and is made from the liver. And so that's why the gallbladder is attached to the liver, because what it holds, the bile that it holds, is made in the liver. The pancreas is also kind of between the liver and the stomach, and we'll learn about the other things as we go on. And like with all of our models, it's much easier to see in the drawn diagram than in the real preserved specimen. Over here, you got all kinds of nice vibrant colors, right? Over here, it's shades of brown and gray. Luckily, you're not going to have to do anything with that on an exam. But if you turn into a surgeon, please, 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 for the sake of us all, get to know what this looks like. Okay, so before we start talking about the individual organs, we need to learn what they are made out of. And for the most part, the structure of these organs are going to be the same from the beginning to the end, especially from the stomach to to the end. And so the walls from the lower esophagus, just above the stomach, all the way down to the anal canal, has the same 4 layers. And so the 4 layers, from the inside moving out, you have mucosa, then submucosa, the muscularis, and then the serosa and the peritoneum, which are kind of considered as one layer. We've learned about the peritoneum before, right? That was one of those serous membranes. And so we have the visceral peritoneum and the parietal peritoneum. This is peritoneum was down in our abdomen area. The parietal peritoneum, remember, is the outside layer. Parietal is the outside layer, visceral is always the inside layer. So the outside layer is going to line the outside of our abdominal cavity. So if I go back, you can imagine that the parietal peritoneum is going to be on the outside here, and then it would be laying over top of all this stuff. And the visceral peritoneum comes down and is kind of like shrink wrap over a lot of these organs. The peritoneum has a couple different subparts we talk about. There's the mesentery and the greater omentum. So I'll skip ahead a couple slides and we'll look at that. And so the greater omentum kind of sits in the front of all of your intestines. So here, you see, this is just part of that peritoneum. It's in the front of the abdomen. Here they just kind of cut it and they've lifted it up like a flap. Whereas the mesentery is more in the organs. The mesentery is more mixed in with the organs, while the greater omentum is a flap over the organs. Coming back to this diagram, we see those 4 main layers. There's more information here than you need. You need to be able to identify these 4 layers. So from the inside out, we have mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and serosa. So the very inside, the open area of the digestive tract is called the lumen. And then we have the walls moving out from there. So the first layer is the mucosa. Then we move out a little bit. So we have the mucosa here, and then the submucosa, and then the muscularis, which is fairly thick. What do you think is in the muscularis? Muscle. What type of muscle? Smooth, yes. Smooth muscle is in your organs. Why do you think there is smooth muscle in your digestive tract? It helps move the food, right? We'll learn how that works. It's called peristalsis. Kind of squeeze on one end and it pushes, when you squeeze again and it pushes, and you squeeze again and it pushes. So we have the muscularis, and then on the outside we have the serosa. And then you could have the peritoneum like shrink wrap on top of here. So here you see the mesentery. Up here it would also continue on down. So we're going to start at the top. We'll start at the mouth. The mouth is also called the oral cavity, and you can probably imagine what forms the borders of your mouth, right? You've got the cheeks on the side, you've got the lips in the front, tongue forms the bottom of your mouth. On top, we have the hard and soft palate. So you've probably heard of the palate. People who are really into food talk about the palate and things like that. If you can feel the top of your mouth, whether you can feel it with your tongue or you are not self-conscious enough to stick your finger in your mouth right now, you can feel in the front of your mouth, there's bone. That's the hard palate. And then as you work your way back towards the back of your mouth, if you're not gagging yet, you can feel where the bone goes away and the roof of your mouth is soft. Okay? That's the soft palate. So the palate is the roof of your mouth. In the front, there's bone. so it's a hard palate, and the back there isn't, and so it's just a soft palate. The mouth is mostly skeletal muscle. The muscle in our mouth, as opposed to down in our actual intestines and things like that, is skeletal muscle, because we have to do a lot of different movements in our mouth. In the intestine, smooth muscle can really only do this. And that's not good enough for our mouth. We need to be able to move our mouth a lot, and our tongue is part of our mouth. And so if our tongue just sat there and went like that, that's not going to do very much. So the mouth is skeletal muscle, and then there is mucous membrane that's going to provide a slick surface in our mouth. We've already learned that the tongue has lingual papilla, right? That's the bumps on your tongue. Some of those papilla have the taste buds. The bumps are not the taste buds. In the tongue, there are some glands that secrete something called lingual lipase. And we've probably said it before, but I'll say it again. If you see something that ends with ASE, that is an enzyme. Enzymes are proteins, and it's an enzyme that is going to break something down. And you normally take whatever's going to get broken down and add ASE on the end. So lipase is an enzyme that breaks down lipids. Lingual refers to tongue, right? If you know Spanish, which I learned, and you all know Spanish, not French, what is tongue in Spanish? Lingua. Tongue, right? Lingual. So, with lingual lipase is secreted by the tongue. Its purpose is to digest triglycerides, which are lipids, but it actually doesn't start immediately. Lingual lipase is only functional in acid. And so it's going to be secreted by the tongue, but where is it going to end up in acid then? The stomach. Because after your mouth, you're going to the stomach. And so once it gets to the stomach, it's going to start breaking down the triglycerides. The saliva is secreted by salivary glands. It has a couple purposes. Number one, it creates the slippery surface in the mouth that allows things to move freely through. But it also is going to contain enzymes that break down carbohydrates. So these enzymes actually do start immediately. So as soon as you get food in your mouth, carbohydrates begin to get digested, but nothing else does. Proteins don't, lipids don't. They don't start to get digested until further on down, but carbohydrates do. So that's one reason why if people have trouble controlling their blood sugar, they make little glucose tablets. You can just chew that and hold it in your mouth. It will actually get digested, and then you can absorb things through your mouth, believe it or not. Underneath your tongue is a very, very good location to absorb things directly into the bloodstream. Some drugs that people have to get into their system very quickly, they're actually called sublingual dosing. You took the pill under your tongue, and it goes straight into your bloodstream. The best example of that is nitroglycerin tablets. People who are having a heart attack, you take nitroglycerin. If you're having a heart attack, you better get that medicine in very, very quickly. And so you can put that tablet under your tongue. The enzymes in your mouth will dissolve the coating on it, and then you have nitroglycerin in your mouth, under your tongue, where it's going to get absorbed. It's actually absorbed so quickly that for a lot of drugs, it's dangerous, because you don't want that much drug getting into your system that quickly. You actually need a slower increase that you get by swallowing it, though. So salivary glands, we have 3 pairs. You don't need to know the names of them. I would know that there are 3 pairs of salivary glands. So in our mouth, with our tongue, with the salivary glands, we also have teeth, which are technically called dentes. These are accessory organs. Remember, these are in joints, right? These were the gomphoses, that little spring-loaded trampoline thing with the collagen holding the teeth in place. The tooth has three main parts. There's the crown, which is the top of the tooth. There's the root, which is the part that goes down into your gums in your jaw. And then there's the neck, which is the kind of the rough area between them. Okay? There's no clean line where one starts and one ends. It's just the crown is more or less the top, the root is the bottom, and the neck is in between. These teeth are made of mostly dentin, which is kind of it's a mixture of organic compounds that your body makes and minerals. And then it's coated by enamel, which is more or less just minerals. So the process of chewing is called mastication. We don't normally call it mastication if it's a person doing it, but if you have something like a cow or a horse, it's much more common to call it mastication. When we chew, the food gets mixed with the saliva, and you don't realize you're doing it, at least until you accidentally bite your tongue, and then you become aware of exactly what's going on in your mouth. But you're actually using your tongue and your teeth to shape that food into a nice little package of food shaped like a ball that you can then swallow. That mixture of food and saliva is called a bolus. So we're going to talk about the bolus moving through the digestive tract. In the saliva, I said there were those enzymes that help start breaking down carbohydrates. The primary one is salivary amylase. So salivary, because it's in the saliva gland, ACE, because it's an enzyme, and amylase is referring to another term for a type of carbohydrate. Particularly starch. But it's also going to start breaking down some of the other carbohydrates. So here we've got the inside of our mouth, which we all know what that looks like. So we've got the tongue, teeth, believe it or not, the white things are the teeth. In the back, we have a little thing that hangs down. You like to see it in the cartoons when they scream and it starts flapping back and forth, right? That is the uvula. Where the epiglottis is a flap that determines whether something coming down your pharynx goes into the trachea or the esophagus. The uvula is a flap that helps prevent food from going up into the nasopharynx. Remember, the nasopharynx is the top of the pharynx, above the mouth, even with the nose. And so usually you would only have air there. That's because when you swallow, this little flap directs food down. But if you have food in your mouth and you hiccup or you laugh or something, you provide some sort of force, that something that's already behind the uvula can then go up. You end up with carbonated soda in your sinuses, which is very, very dangerous, right? Yep. Or you get milk and then it turns into sour milk in your face. So we're not going to talk about the different types of teeth, but I think you probably understand the purposes of the three main shapes of teeth that you have. So we've taken food in our mouth, hopefully, and then once we swallow, it's going to go into our pharynx. Pharynx, remember, is another term for the throat. Pharynx is the technical term for our throat. Our pharynx is, like our mouth, mostly skeletal muscle with mucous membrane. We're not down to the smooth muscle part yet. That then connects to the esophagus, where it splits. So the pharynx splits into the trachea and the esophagus. This time we're taking the path down the esophagus. The esophagus is a tube surrounded by muscle. So the upper part of that esophagus is going to be skeletal muscle, and then the bottom part of that esophagus is going to be smooth muscle. So this transition from skeletal to smooth occurs in the esophagus. The esophagus has two sphincters. So a sphincter is just an area of smooth muscle that can completely close. So the other parts of the digestive tract, so in between those sphincters, it can contract to kind of help push things through, but it can't completely close. A sphincter will completely close a tube. So there are two of them. There's the upper esophageal sphincter, and then the lower esophageal sphincter. The upper one is further up in the esophagus, and so it's made of skeletal muscle. The lower one is going to be where the esophagus empties into the stomach, and down there it is smooth muscle. And so we're going to swallow, going to go into our pharynx, into our esophagus, and yes, gravity is going to help pull it down, but we're going to help it by using peristalsis. So imagine you have a hose or a tube with water in it. If you grab it, squeeze it, and then move your hand down that hose, you're going to push the water out as you go. That's essentially what's going to happen here. So imagine we have our tube, and we have a bolus of food in our esophagus. It's just sitting there. If we squeeze right there, where's that bolus going to go?
Down.
Down. And so this is going to move down. Now it's down here. So we squeeze there. And we just keep pushing it down and down and down until it gets down into the stomach. Once it's in the stomach, then it gets all turned around, go from the stomach into the intestine, and then this peristalsis is going to take it through the intestine. So the swallowing has two parts. There's a voluntary part and the involuntary part, which is called the pharyngeal stage. What do you think is the voluntary part of swallowing? After the chewing, well, what do you think of when you think of swallowing?
Goes to the throat.
Right. Going from the mouth to the throat, right? So that's what most people think of as swallowing. That is voluntary. You could decide when that happens, when that doesn't happen. The involuntary part is something that you wouldn't generally consider part of swallowing. Swallowing also includes the peristalsis, taking it down the esophagus. You can't control that. Once you let it in up here, then it does its thing. So that's involuntary. So this is exactly what you know goes on. You eat something, you swallow it, ends up in the pharynx, it goes down into the esophagus. This is that peristalsis happening. We've got a bolus of food, we're going to squeeze, push it down, then as it's moving down, we're just going to move this tight part down as it goes. So just keep it tight behind it and keep on pushing it down. Eventually, we'll reach the lower esophageal sphincter, which is normally closed, but when the bolus reaches the end, it opens up to allow food through. Now, my question to you is, why have that gate there? Why not just leave it open so that as soon as it gets down, the food ends up in the stomach?
But you don't if you lay down or go upside down, everything's just going to come up.
Exactly. You need to keep stuff from coming back up. You have a lot of harsh stuff in the stomach. If that comes up, it's acid reflux or heartburn, right? Short term, it's uncomfortable. Long term, you will literally digest your esophagus. And that's not good. So now we're down into the stomach. Stomach has four parts. Again, they're kind of fuzzy regions. There's no clear line where you say, this is the cardia and this is the fundus. But if we look So we're coming down the esophagus. Right where the esophagus empties into the stomach is the cardia. And then the stomach kind of bulges up a little bit. That peak at the top there is the fundus. The main part of the stomach here is the body. And then the pylorus is the bottom of the stomach where it's going to empty into the intestine. So the cardia is where it first enters. The fundus sticks up. The body makes up the body of the stomach, the vast majority of it. And then the pylorus is going to be down at the bottom. And luckily enough, if you ignore the body is the biggest part. That's easy to remember. The other three are in alphabetical order, right? C, F, P. So the stomach is part of the GI. Oh, actually, we're not. Let me skip this. Actually, that's exactly what I was going to talk about, though. It's part of the GI. It has those same four layers: mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, right? And so here we see we have the mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and serosa. So this is part of the bottom of the stomach, and so the lumen, the open part of the stomach, is up here. Get the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis, and the serosa. Yes, there's a lot of stuff going on there. We're not going to be too concerned about it. You need to know that you have the same four layers. The surface of that, the mucosa, in that we have a number of different glands. We're going to make mucus. Why do we need mucus in our stomach?
So the stomach acid doesn't eat through our stomach?
Yes. We're going to coat the inside of our stomach with mucus so that the stomach acid doesn't actually come in contact with the living part of our stomach. If it does, what does that turn into? An ulcer. Yeah. So if you have something that allows that stomach acid to get through the mucus and start digesting your stomach, that is an ulcer. Stomach acid is hydrochloric acid. That is literally what it is. And so we have glands that secrete hydrochloric acid. We have glands that secrete pepsin. It says apepsin because pepsin is a class of enzymes. Okay? And so pepsins are enzymes that break down proteins. It's also called a protease. Ace means breaking down a protein. There is intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is a hormone that causes the secretion of hydrochloric acid. And so there's a gland in your stomach that controls the gland that secretes hydrochloric acid. And then there's also something called gastrin, which is another hormone. We get all that stuff in our stomach. We're going to digest it chemically using our enzymes and our acid. We're also going to digest it mechanically, just by squeezing and mixing. Okay? That is called maceration. Maceration is the mixing that goes on in our stomach. Mixes it with the food, with the gastric juice, kind of all a mixture of all of this stuff. You mix the food with the gastric juice, and you get chyme. So bolus was the mixture of food and saliva. Once that gets into the stomach, it mixes with all the stomach juices and turns into chyme. We said that pepsin was an enzyme that breaks down proteins. It does that by cutting peptide bonds. Peptide bonds, remember, were the bonds that hold amino acids together to make a protein. If you cut those peptide bonds, you take a protein and you break it down into amino acids. Your body can absorb amino acids, it can't absorb proteins. We've got the mucus coating the inside. Our lingual lipase that was secreted by our tongue is now in the hydrochloric acid, so it's starting to break down the lipids. The stomach wall is more or less not going to absorb anything. Most things are going to pass from the stomach into the intestine, and that's where the majority of absorption is going to happen. There are a few things, though, that your stomach can absorb directly. That's water, ions such as salt, short-chain fatty acids, some very, very simple fats, and some drugs. Now let's back up a bit. Why do you think you would want your stomach to be able to absorb water?
Because you need water to live.
You need water to live, yes, but you also need nutrients to live. So why are nutrients going to get absorbed later on? Or so some of the water is going to get absorbed right
Isn't
up
everything
top.
water soluble? Like the water passes through most of the cells, take it out first, and easier later on.
There's a simpler explanation. You said water is needed to live, right? But so is nutrients. But what's the difference between water needed to live and nutrients needed to live?
You got me.
Which is going to kill you faster?
Water.
Dehydration, right? Dehydration is going to kill you faster than malnutrition. And so if you're dehydrated, you can drink something and you get water into your body very quickly. It doesn't have to go to the stomach, down to the intestines. You may be dead by then. But if you're malnourished, most likely you're not going to die in the half hour it takes that food to go from your stomach to your intestines. Aspirin is an example of a drug that gets into our stomach, gets absorbed by our stomach very, very easily. Probably, how many people take aspirin or have taken aspirin? You've probably seen that most aspirin is safety coated, right? There's a coating on it. What that coating is, it's a carbohydrate coating on the outside of that aspirin. Your stomach does not digest carbohydrates. Carbohydrates get digested in your intestine, okay? If you hold it too long in your mouth, yes, it's going to start to break down. But once it gets down into your stomach, it's not going to get digested. And so the aspirin doesn't actually contact the acid. It can't dissolve because it's coated in this solid carbohydrate layer. If you take an uncoated aspirin, it gets absorbed in the stomach. Why do you not want aspirin absorbed by your stomach? What happens if you take too much aspirin?
Destroys your liver.
It actually gives you ulcers. So aspirin plays a number of roles in our body. One of them, aspirin will actually stop the mucus secretion in your stomach. And so if you have very high concentrations of aspirin in your stomach, because that's where it was absorbed, you have very little mucus secretion in your stomach. The acid starts to eat your stomach and you get ulcers. A dose or two is not going to hurt you, okay? It's if someone who is taking aspirin or other NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen and Aleve, they, long-term, will give you ulcers if you take the non-coated version, okay? At this point, pretty much all of them are coated. And so you have to take them for a very, 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 very long time at high doses to get ulcers. If you take, they suggest taking a baby aspirin once a day to prevent heart attacks. If that's safety coated, you take it one pill a day, and it's a very, very tiny pill, that's not going to give you a problem. Also, alcohol gets absorbed very easily by your stomach, primarily because alcohol looks very similar to water. So that's why somebody drinks something and they get drunk very quickly. Because as soon as it gets to their stomach, it starts to get absorbed. next to the stomach is the pancreas. We already learned about the pancreas, but remember it has two functions. There's an endocrine function, but there's also an exocrine function. Endocrine function was the glucagon and the insulin. Those get secreted into the blood. The exocrine functions always secrete to the outside of the body, or at least something that leads to the outside. So this is going to secrete into the duodenum, which is the very, very first part of your small intestine. So it's the first part of the small intestine that attaches to your stomach. The pancreas, the exocrine part of the pancreas, is going to secrete into the small intestine, specifically the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum. If you look at the pancreas under a microscope, you'll see that it's made up of a whole bunch of clusters of epithelial cells, and those clusters are called acini. They secrete a mixture of things. There's some water and fluid, along with digestive enzymes. So those digestive enzymes in the fluid are called pancreatic juice. And yes, juice is the technical term. Pancreatic juice. And this has things that are going to dissolve and digest a lot of things in our body. Okay? It's going to make the enzymes that break down some starch. We had a different amylase earlier, but the pancreas is going to secrete more. Then we're going to make more enzymes that break down proteins, enzymes that break down triglycerides, and also nucleic acids. We haven't talked about those. We don't really think of those as nutrients, but nucleic acids are nutrients. We take in a lot of DNA, a lot of RNA. You would be surprised at how much there is in the food, and especially meat and plant matter that you eat. Okay, if there are cells in there, there's a lot of DNA and RNA. Okay, and so we need to be able to break that down so we can absorb it. We can't absorb DNA or RNA. We absorb nucleic acids, and so we make an enzyme called nuclease that breaks down nucleic acid. These little clusters of cells make up the pancreatic islets, which are also the islets of Langerhans, which we saw in the endocrine function also. And so that is the endocrine portion of pancreas. Here we've got the stomach. Pancreas is going to sit here, kind of looks like a big yellow maggot. Right? The stomach here, esophagus is coming down. The liver, which we haven't talked about, is actually above the stomach a little bit. It's not as far above as it looks like in that diagram. When we get across the hall to the lab and we look at this, the liver and the stomach are kind of almost one behind the other. The liver almost sits in front of the stomach. And then there is the bile ducts leading into the gallbladder. They can count. I think this is a good time for a break. We'll come back at 7 o'clock on the clock. All the way at the bottom.
Oh, I'm just tired. I'm just like, not really. You're just not good here. Music class.
But that's music class.
Yeah,
So it's, yeah, it's okay. Such a bad thing.
What?
Don't get that far.
question. So we were talking about the esophagus and all of how it goes. So what happens when you throw up?
So,
Something.
when we throw up,
Is it like that complicated?
They're
Or?
good though, I like
no,
those.
it's more it's not the reverse process. It's essentially all the stuff down the bottom contracting very strongly, which then forces for everything up very quickly.
So is that a main reason for throwing up? Like usually, or because
So usually it's because our body recognizes there's something in our stomach that is hazardous to us. And so if it's in our stomach, there's only two ways out, up and down. It's a whole lot quicker to go that way.
yeah, but why would it kick it out? That's what I asked.
Because why would it?
Yeah.
If it realized this is something that's dangerous to me. But like it's spoiled food or a chemical or something.
Okay. So I'm not used to eating pork because I can't. But I ate it once by accident and I threw it up. After I realized that it was it.
So my guess.
It's like a new.
It could have been either your body was not used to it, but you eat beef.
Yeah.
So to me, beef and pork are probably fairly similar. In terms of chemical composition, they're probably fairly similar. And so either it could have been an issue of there was something different, so your body said, I don't know what this is, get it
Or
out.
it might be a psychological.
Or it could have been psychological.
And you're like, let's get that.
Like when someone watches something very gross or disgusting, they throw up.
Probably. I'm not having one. But I get it. Yeah. Feel like I'm on. Have to go with it.
Did you enjoy my bird duck thing?
Your bird duck thing?
It doesn't look like a duck. I meant to draw one.
She wants to see your duck. Oh, wow.
Wait, no,
Pigeon.
the long. In the swamp? Yes. Looks like a stork. A baby stork.
Cranes.
Long legs. Yeah.
Cranes.
Praise the Lord, hamster.
So trick or treating though? Oh, they didn't. Alright. They probably knew better. I tried. I tried. I just wanted to sit down.
For the exam, I realized I didn't go over the respiratory chapter, and I realized all of the ones I missed were two the respiratory chapter.
I got 109 out of 120. You're so stupid.
Okay. Moving on to the liver. The liver is really important, but it actually can get forgotten a lot of times. Okay? I took physiology in graduate school. In my graduate level physiology course, did not talk about the liver at all. I always thought that was really, really weird. Okay? But we are not going to forget about the liver, because I guarantee you there are questions in the final exam about the liver. So we can't skip the liver. The liver, behind our skin, is the second largest organ in our body. Okay? The liver is surprisingly big. Okay? I've never seen a whole human liver, but I know from a rat, where a rat is about that big, the liver is about that big. Okay? It's fairly large. The liver is attached to the gallbladder, which we saw in a diagram a little bit earlier. The gallbladder stores bile, which is made by the liver. When we start looking inside of the liver, there are several different parts. The main part are the liver cells, which are called hepatocytes. A hepatocyte is just a technical term for a liver cell. Then there are bile canaliculi, which just look at it as bile canals. Okay? These are little canals that are going to carry the bile from the liver where they're made to the gallbladder where it's stored. That's all they are. There are hepatic sinusoids. What do you think a hepatic sinusoid is, just based on the name? So hepatic refers to liver. That's why the liver cells are hepatocytes. What is a sinus? Sinus, we have sinuses in our face, right? What is a sinus? It's an opening. It's a cavity. Okay? And so a hepatic sinusoid are little cavities throughout the liver, and they contain Kupffer cells. This is the term people use. I have never heard anyone actually use the big, long, fancy word. Okay? Yes. Reticuloendothelial cells. I've never heard that. People use Kupffer cells all the time, though. If you're dealing with this type of cell, people call them Kupffer cells. Kupffer cells are part of the immune system. Okay? There's a lot of blood that goes through our liver, and one of the main functions of the liver is to kind of filter our blood. And so if we get bad things in our blood, they end up in the liver, and so we need immune cells in the liver to kill those things. Yes?
What do the sinuses
sinusoids are just cavities, they're little areas
Oh,
that
store
hold
those cells.
the Kupffer cells.
Okay.
Yes. And then there are a couple different veins. There is a central vein and a hepatic vein. It depends on where those veins are going. Hepatocytes, the vast majority of cells in the liver produce bile. They go through the bile canaliculi into the bile duct. A duct is a large tube that then leads to the gallbladder. In the gallbladder, it's stored, waiting until the time that it's needed. And when it's needed, the gallbladder can contract. When the gallbladder contracts, it shoots that bile into your intestine, and the bile's purpose is to emulsify lipids. Okay? And emulsification is a somewhat complicated idea. Okay? The process isn't complicated, but it's a very complex idea. Okay? So what do you know about lipids and water? They don't mix, right? Lipids are fats and oils. They do not mix with water. What is the majority of blood? What's it made out of?
Water.
Water. We need to get lipids into our blood. But the blood is water and the lipids are lipids. And so we need to get that fat into our bloodstream one way or another. Now, what do you do if you have oil on your hands and you want to get it off your hands? You add soap. You can rinse your hands all day. If you have oil on your hands, it's not coming off. If you have something like sugar on your hands, you get sticky maple syrup or something, you run it under water itself and it goes away. Because sugar dissolves in water. But the oil does not. And so you need soap to get it off. Soap emulsifies fats and oils and lipids. Okay? So when you emulsify something with soap, what you end up with is a droplet of oil or fat or lipid. Okay? And then out here we have water. Okay? So we have a droplet of lipid in water. And then you actually get soap molecules lined up right on the border. And a soap molecule has two parts. It's like a phospholipid. There is a charged part, and then there is a hydrophobic lipophilic part. Okay? This is more chemical than you need to know. But basically what happens is because you have one half of this that likes lipids and one half that likes water, they line up right along that border. And so you have kind of like a mediator. The soap acts as a way to allow the lipids to get along with the water. Lipids don't like water, but lipids like soap, and soap likes water. And so you are allowed to get the lipid into the water. So that's what bile does. It allows you to get droplets of lipids into your bloodstream. And once they're into the bloodstream, they can be digested further. And even then, if they're emulsified in the intestines, they're easier to digest. If you have a big clump of fat in your intestines, it's not going to digest very well. If you break it down into small pieces, it's going to digest much easier. So here's the inside of a liver. And so all the pink area here are the hepatocytes. They make bile. The bile empties into the hepatic sinusoids and the bile canaliculi, which lead into the bile duct. The liver does a whole lot more than make bile, though. It makes bile, it breaks down in the blood cells, but it also has a lot of other purposes. Those Kupffer cells are going to carry out phagocytosis. We learned about phagocytosis in the immune system lecture. That's where you just eat invaders. Bacteria in the blood end up in the liver, and the Kupffer cells are just going to eat them up. The liver also helps to break down things like carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. Some of the hormones in our body are inactive when they're first made. So we may have an endocrine gland in our body that makes a hormone. It goes into the bloodstream, but it's not active. Once it gets to the liver, then it gets converted into the active form. This is also a very big deal for drugs. When we take a pill or any other sort of drug, the majority of those drugs are going to get broken down by the liver. The liver detoxifies your blood. And the drugs that we take in are viewed as toxins. Okay? And so there are a lot of enzymes, proteins in our liver that break down chemicals, including our drugs. So you take a pill, eventually you have to take another one, right? It doesn't work anymore because your liver broke it down. So it's going to break down those drugs. Liver, we learned, excretes the bilirubin. It also helps to store vitamins and minerals. Some of the things that we eat, the nutrients that our body needs, if we have extra of them, we can store them in our liver. And then, sort of similar to this hormone and drug thing, the vitamin D gets finished and completed in our liver. Okay? The process starts in our skin. That's why we need some UV exposure to start the process of making vitamin D. But once it's started, it then goes into the bloodstream, ends up in the liver, and then it gets converted into its final active form. Okay. Moving on down, we're now into the small intestine. And remember, the small intestine is the first intestine. So the small intestine receives the food about 2 to 4 hours from the time that you swallow it. Most of that time between that is going to be spent in the stomach. And the time food spends in your stomach is based on a number of things. Temperature, how many calories are in there, and the salt content. Why would your stomach control how fast food goes into your intestine based on temperature, do you think? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say something too hot to hurt the tissues.
Yeah. Our stomach is a very, very tough thing. Also, same with our throat, right? You get some really hot pizza in your mouth, you try to blow it off, your mouth is burning, you either spit it out or you swallow it. As soon as you swallow it, your mouth's not burning, you don't really burn your throat. Your mouth is sensitive, your throat is not, right? And so your intestines would be very sensitive. If you had something very hot that got into your intestines, you could damage them. Also, what about cold, though? What about cold?
Same thing.
Same thing. If you get really cold in your intestines, you can damage those sensitive tissues. Our stomach is also up a little bit higher. Our abdomen is a very, very warm place with a lot of blood. And so if we took something cold in and then immediately put it into our intestines, that wasn't just me, was it?
No.
Considering everybody else kind of started looking around, I don't think it was. If you got a whole bunch of really cold water, your body would cool off very, very quickly. And so that could be a bad thing right? And so we want to maintain our body temperature. So we slowly cool down based off of that cool water. Do you have another question?
Yeah, doesn't really cold water absorb slower?
Yes, because of this. So we said a lot of the water, some of the water is going to get absorbed by the stomach. The vast majority is going to be absorbed by the intestine. So if it's cold water, it stays in your stomach. So it's not getting absorbed very fast.
So they tell you to drink tap water after running.
Yep. Yep. Because it's going to stay in your, if you drink cold water, it's going to stay in your stomach. And if you drink cold water, it gets in your stomach, and some of it gets in your intestine. What happened? What? Cramping. Yes. Cold water will cause cramps. That's your body responding to that cold water that it doesn't like.
My mother-in-law refuses to drink cold water, like anywhere.
Really?
She's like, I will not drink cold water. Has to be room temperature.
Also, it stays in your stomach depending on salt content. Why do you think that is? If you have too low salt content or too high, it'll stay in your stomach longer and very slowly empty into your intestine. What would happen, do you think, if you got a whole bunch of salt in your bloodstream at once?
You die.
It was a whole lot, you would die. But if it's not enough to kill you, it could make you sick, right? Or if there's very little salt, you would dilute the salt that is in your blood. And so your blood would have too low salt concentration. And so you would slowly get that into the bloodstream. But if the salt content in your food or whatever you drink was the same as in your blood, there's no reason to hold it back. Let it in. That's why things like Gatorade and Powerade have electrolytes. They match your bloodstream. And so it stays in your stomach a very short time before going into your intestine. Same thing with caloric content. Very, very high calories. You don't want a whole bunch of sugar getting into your bloodstream at once. So if you eat something like a piece of cake, it's going to stay in your stomach longer than if you eat something, I can't even think of something healthy at the moment. So if you eat something that was something like carrots. Say you ate some carrots. They're not going to stay in your stomach as long because there's not as many calories, and so your body can handle the number of calories in a carrot in a very short period of time. That's why there's also some sugar in Gatorade and Powerade, but not too much. So, once we leave the stomach, we're in our small intestine. It averages 1 inch in diameter and about 10 feet long as you're alive. After that, you're on your own. All right? Who knows? So the small intestine goes from the pyloric sphincter. This pyloric sphincter is at the bottom of the stomach, what holds the stuff in the stomach, keeps it from going down. When it opens, the stomach is going to empty into the small intestine. And then it's going to go on down to the ileocecal sphincter, which is going to separate the small intestine from the large intestine. The small intestine is made up of 3 parts with fun names: duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. I think they would all make good pet names. In the small intestine, we have some glands that make enzymes, the digestive enzymes, and also mucus. In the intestine, we have digestive enzymes. We have stomach acid. We can't somehow leave the stomach acid behind and get the food on through. The stomach acid ends up in our intestines. And so we need mucus in our intestines also in order to try to prevent them from getting digested. It's also going to secrete some base to neutralize the acid. And so our intestines are not nearly as acidic as our stomach. The main function of the small intestine and the intestines as a whole is absorption. And if you're going to absorb food, you want as much of the intestine touching the food as possible. Because if you have a hollow tube, only the food on the very outside is touching the tube, so you can only absorb a small amount. All the food in the center does not get absorbed. And so we have a lot of ruffles and bumps in our intestine to increase the amount of surface area. We have microvilli. We learned about those on the cells. That's on the cellular level. We take multiple cells, though. We can kind of put them in a wave shape. We get villi. And then you actually take the whole intestine and kind of fold it in on itself. We get circular folds. So we've got the stomach. You're going to empty into the small intestine here, into the duodenum. The duodenum comes on down, turns into a lot of this, which is the jejunum. And then that empties into the ileum. So the parts get longer as you go. The duodenum is only about a foot long. And then the jejunum is about 3 feet long. And the ileum is about 6 feet long. And these are those folds we were just talking about. So at the real world level, you see all these folds. It's just kind of taking the intestine that would normally be like that and folding it in. And so you get a whole bunch of folds. You can see if food goes through there, it's going to be touching a lot of intestines. And so we can absorb it very, very easily. At the more microscopic level, here we have a fold. And then we zoom in a little bit, and then on the fold, we have the villi. The villi are made up of cells, and the cells themselves have microvilli. But we do have some mechanical digestion that goes on in the small intestine. The stomach, its main purpose is to help mix things up, to help digest it. In the small intestine, it's going to do it a little bit, but it's really just kind of so that the stuff, as it's moving through, you don't absorb all the stuff from the outside, and the stuff in the very, very center doesn't touch anything. You just got to keep it churning so that everything gets a chance to get absorbed. And so we're going to do that again through peristalsis, and then also another form of movement called segmentations, and that's related to peristalsis, but it helps to push the food on through. So we're now on our intestine. All of the enzymes that were secreted above the intestine are still there. The things that were in the saliva, things that came from our tongue, things that came from our stomach, things that came from the pancreas and the liver, they're all mixed in here. And so now we have a whole bunch of stuff that are going to really, really break down our food. This is where our sugars, our disaccharides, polysaccharides, monosaccharides are going to get broken down. The proteins are really, really digested here. They started to get digested a little bit earlier, and now they're going to get completely digested. Same thing with the triglycerides and the nucleic acids. The heavy lifting in terms of digestion is going to happen in the small intestine, and then 90% of those nutrients are going to get absorbed in the small intestine. The small intestine serves a very, very important purpose. It does most of the digestion, it does most of the absorption. The other 10% is split between the stomach and the large intestine. So in the small intestine, we're going to absorb food. Absorption is just taking nutrients from the food in the lumen of the intestine and getting them into our bloodstream. There are a number of ways that things can get from one side of that intestine to the other. Okay? Imagine you have a cross-section of an intestine, and then we have, well, let's say we have a Pop-Tart in our intestine, or let's say we have a carrot, if you're healthy. So we need to get those things into our bloodstream. We have arteries and veins that are wrapped around our intestine. And the intestine is the wall between them. We need to get the nutrients well, there's not any nutrients there, but there's nutrients in the carrot, okay? We need to get those things into our bloodstream. And so they happen, number one, just by simple diffusion. If we have a lot of sugar in the Pop-Tart, and not a lot of sugar in the blood, the sugar is just going to work its way into the bloodstream. It's going to go from high concentration to low. We also have facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion is very basically diffusion, where things go from high concentration to low. It's just there's a barrier in the way. Some things, like very simple sugars and salts, can pass across the intestine on their own. But things like some larger sugars, so something like a disaccharide or a polysaccharide, is going to have a transporter or a pore that will allow it to get through. It's not going to pump it. It's not going to use energy. It's going to something that's going to allow it across that wall. If we're absorbing water, it's going to happen through osmosis. We're going to have more water in our intestine than out here in our blood. So the water is going to go from here to here. And then there are some nutrients that will not go on their own. And so we're going to use active transport to pump them into the bloodstream. So once we have these things, they're going to end up in the bloodstream, the capillaries that are wrapped around the intestines. Monosaccharides, amino acids, and small acids can go in there directly. Large fatty acids, triglycerides, monoglycerides, they're going to get absorbed in the form of a micelle. And a micelle is just that droplet of oil that we had in the soap. Okay? A micelle is the technical term for that droplet of oil. So we're going to absorb whole droplets if they're complex lipids. Small intestine is also where we're going to absorb most of the water, our electrolytes, and our vitamins. So this is just a simple diagram showing we've got the food. So the food is out here, and then we've got basically a fold of the intestine, and so then we've got the blood vessels going through there. So we have to get the food from here into here. And then once it's in here, it'll work its way back to the heart and get pumped all over the place. When you absorb something in your intestine, it ends up in this hepatic portal vein, which leads to your liver. Everything that gets absorbed by your intestine goes to the liver first. Why do you think that is? Toxins, yes. The liver, one of the main functions of the liver is to get toxins out of your blood. There's a lot of things in what we eat, whether on purpose or on accident, that are not good for us. And so this gives the liver a chance to take those out before it gets into the main bloodstream, gets pumped to things like our brain. After the small intestine, we have the large intestine. It averages 2.5 inches diameter, about 5 feet in length. And apparently, it doesn't matter if you're alive or dead. So this goes from the ileocecal sphincter to the anus. The ileocecal sphincter was the end of the small intestine, which makes it the beginning of the large intestine. And the anus is just the complete end of the line. And so the large intestine gets broken down into 4 main parts: the cecum, the colon, the rectum, and the anal canal. And the colon has 4 parts, and we'll see these in a nice diagram. The mucosa, remember the mucosa is the innermost layer of the GI tract. Here, we also have cells that are going to absorb. Remember, some of the absorption is going to happen in our large intestine, primarily water, and then we have our goblet cells that secrete mucus. We learned about goblet cells at the beginning of the semester in our histology lecture. Goblet cells are those cells that look like upside down wine glasses that secrete mucus, and that is what they do. In the large intestine, we not only have peristalsis, we have mass peristalsis. This is a very, very strong force. We're not just moving things slowly through the process, we need to actually expel things out of our body. So we need larger force. Some things are going to get further broken down in this large intestine, but for the most part, by the time they get there, they're completely broken down. In our large intestine, we have a lot of bacteria, beneficial bacteria. Some of the vitamins we need, we are not capable of making. And so there are bacteria in our large intestine that take vitamins and nutrients that we eat. When it gets to the large intestine, those bacteria take those nutrients and convert them into vitamins that we then absorb. And so if we don't have the correct bacteria in our large intestine, we can become malnourished and become sick. So there are bacteria in our large intestine that take nutrients and vitamins that we eat. They work their way through the GI tract. They get to the large intestine. The bacteria eat them and convert them into something else. And that may be a vitamin that we need to be healthy, that we cannot make ourselves. We need the bacteria to make it for us, actually. And so, if you take antibiotics, say you get an infection, you take antibiotics, a lot of times if you take antibiotics for more than a couple days, you get diarrhea. And that's because those antibiotics are non-selective. They're killing the good bacteria along with the bad. And so you're killing these good bacteria in your large intestine. And so they can suggest taking probiotics.
They help.
Yeah, so probiotics are kind of, it's one of those things that in clinical trials, or at least unofficial clinical trials, in experience, they seem to work. But scientifically, it just seems like there's no reason they should, because there's no way that those bacteria should reach that far. But what they have definitely shown, and it is gross to think about, but it's called a fecal transplant. They literally take feces from one person with a healthy gut flora, bacteria in their intestine, and transfer it into someone else's large intestine. And it's gross to think about, but it is literally life-saving for some people. So here's our large intestine. And so the small intestine is kind of nestled in the center here. And so it ends in the ileum. So this is the very, very end of the small intestine. So the ileum empties into the cecum. The cecum is just this very first part of the large intestine that receives food from the small intestine. It's a small area. We go from the cecum to the ascending colon, which goes up, luckily. Then we get up, and then we have the transverse colon, which goes over, and the descending colon, which comes back down, and then the sigmoid colon, which is kind of S-shaped, and then the rectum, which is the bottom just after the sigmoid colon, and then a very short anal canal, and then the anus. This is part of the GI tract, especially the lower GI tract, and so we have the same 4 layers: mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, serosa. In the large intestine, we said we absorb water, some ions, and some vitamins. What's in the large intestine is feces. And there is a lot of stuff in those feces. There's a lot of water. There are salts. There's a whole lot of dead cells from our GI tract. Our GI tract is in contact with a whole lot of bad things along the way. The acid, the digestive enzymes, they're constantly getting damaged, and so they don't live very long. And so all those cells that die end up in the feces. There's also a lot of bacteria. You'd be surprised to realize how much bacteria are in your feces. There's all the things that the bacteria made. There is the nutrients that passed through before you were able to digest them. And then there is the undigestible part of the food. And what's a common term for that? I think I heard it. Somebody. Maybe I'm not hearing the answer in my mind. Starts with an F? Fiber. Fiber. Fiber is the undigestible part of the food. And so it provides a solid something to help push everything else through. That's why fiber helps with digestion and keeping you regular. Otherwise you end up with this soft mush that peristalsis doesn't work very well with. Also, fiber can reduce the risk of cancer because think about all the nasty stuff that is now in your feces. Okay? You have all these toxins that were made by your body that are going out through your feces. If that sits in your large intestine for a long time, your large intestine does absorb some stuff. And so you get more of these toxins into your bloodstream that should have passed out before they got absorbed. So fiber can help keep things moving on their way. The technical term for going to the bathroom is defecation. Teach your little kid that word, right? I need to defecate. And so there are a couple things that lead to this. We're going to contract the diaphragm and abdominal muscles to help push down while releasing or relaxing the external sphincters. So sphincters are what keep everything in, so we're not just constantly losing feces as we go. And so we need to open those up while pushing from the top. So taking a slightly more global look at digestion, digestion itself can be broken down into a few stages. There's the cephalic phase. What does the cephalic phase sound like? Head. Cephalic region is your head. So this is the digestion that's going to happen in your head. Mostly those enzymes that are in your saliva that are going to break down the carbohydrates. Sorry. That's the cephalic phase. Then there's the gastric phase. Gastric means stomach. And then there's digestion in your stomach. And then the intestinal phase, what does that sound like? 4 or 5 of you are listening. Yes, the intestinal phase happens in the intestines. So the cephalic phase is not, the actual breakdown is those salivary enzymes, but it's also having to do with our brain. If you smell something tasty, you start to salivate. And so our brain does play a role in that. Even if we think about food, Pop-Tarts, right? Carrots. If carrots make you salivate, I am envious. Carrots do not make me salivate. Okay? And so that is going to increase the production from the salivary glands. It's also going to make our stomach start making gastric juices. getting ready for the food that we're about to eat. Once the food actually gets to the stomach, then we start the gastric phase, which involves a whole lot more enzymes and things being secreted by the stomach, and then also the contraction of the stomach. And then we're going to move it from the stomach into the intestine, which is gastric emptying. And then we're in the intestinal phase where we're going to finish breaking down the nutrients, we're going to move them along, and we're going to absorb them. How fast we move things from our stomach to our intestine is also going to be determined by how fast things in our intestine are moving. We can't have a traffic jam. We can only fit so much stuff in our intestine at once. So if our intestines are still full and you eat again, those things are going to stay in your stomach until what's in your small intestine has moved on. All of this is kind of kept in line, going in the right order by a couple of hormones called secretin and cholecystokinin. Cholecystokinin. That's a tough one to say. And that is that. Okay. Questions about digestive system?
So we need to know what that last word is.
You need to know that you need to know that it's you need to know that it's a hormone that controls digestion.
Stay there.
Cholecystokinin.